You ever wake up thinking your day is going to be normal coffee, a bit of yard work only to find a mini skate park where your prized tulips used to be? Yeah, that was my Tuesday. Name's Xander Sutton. I'm a 39-year-old mechanic, been living on this corner lot for 6 years now. I built my flower garden from scratch. Every petal, every stone path, every little metal gnome, I put them there with my own hands. It was my piece. Until Lorraine Edgewood, president of our homeowner association and full-time menace, decided peace wasn't in the HOA's budget. I was sipping my usual morning brew on the porch when I heard the unmistakable clank of metal ramps. I followed the noise around the side of the house and stopped dead. There they were, two quarter pipes, a grind rail, and a plywood launch ramp sitting smack in the middle of my flower garden like they belonged there. 3 kids I didn't recognize were skating like it was the X Games. "What the hell is this?" I shouted. One of the kids bailed off the rail. Mrs. Edgewood said it was cool. Of course she did. I marched straight to her house, her smug little colonial across the street with a stupid flamingo mailbox. She was out front, pruning roses that definitely weren't hers. "Lorraine," I said, trying to keep from yelling, "why is there a skate park on my property?" She looked up like I'd asked her if the sky was blue.
"Oh, Xander.
Don't be dramatic. That area wasn't being used for anything useful. We needed a recreational zone for the neighborhood teens." "On my land." She nodded once, like a queen granting me the honor of her nonsense. The HOA voted. It was unanimous. "I never got a vote." She sniffed. "Well, technically, we didn't notify you directly. But the board agreed it was for the greater good. You had daisies over there, Xander." "Daisies." I felt my jaw tighten. "You know that's private property, right?" Her smile snapped into a frown. "It's community adjacent. There's a clause. Section 8, paragraph 12. Shared use zones under HOA discretion." I'd read the rules front to back when I moved in. There was no such clause, and she knew it. But Lorraine loved to toss around fake legalese like confetti. "You've got 1 hour to tear it down," I said. She shrugged. "I'd love to, but it's already funded. The ramps are bolted in. Cemented, actually. And removal would be prohibitively expensive." I turned and walked away. I wasn't about to scream at her on her lawn. Not yet. But I had something Lorraine didn't know about. My cousin, Diego. Full-time cop. Part-time bulldozer when it comes to people like her. And I had a plan. By the time I got back to my garage, I'd stopped shaking. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I opened the tool cabinet and pulled out the folder I kept tucked behind the breaker box. Property lines, plat maps, and the original deed. Every inch of my lot had been surveyed and stamped when I bought it. I knew exactly where my line ended 6 feet past the edge of the flower bed. Lorraine's little skate park wasn't just trespassing. It was a deliberate, calculated land grab. I called Diego on speaker while I photographed the damage. "She put what on your lawn?" he said, dropping his voice when a radio squawked in the background. 2 ramps, a rail, and plywood. "And she cemented them in." There was a pause. "That's construction on private property without consent. That's not just a zoning violation. That could hit criminal trespass and property destruction, depending on the damage." She claims there's a clause in the HOA agreement. Section 8, paragraph 12. That's made up. They don't have that kind of authority unless you signed an easement or a right-of-way. Did you? No, good. Don't touch anything else. I'll swing by after my shift. And Xander? Yeah. Get your security cams running. Don't give them room to maneuver. I hung up and did exactly that. I had 3 cameras, one on the porch, one over the garage, and a third I never bothered mounting. I set it on a tripod facing the ramps. Then I sat at the kitchen table and went through the HOA bylaws for the second time that year. There was no mention of shared use zones. No clause about discretionary recreational development. What I did find, however, was a section that required a 2/3 homeowner majority for any alteration to common areas, which didn't even apply here, because my yard wasn't common anything. Then I pulled up the county assessor's office website. Lorraine had filed permits in the past tree removals, sidewalk repairs under the HOA account, but nothing had been submitted for construction or landscaping in the last 6 months. That meant no work order, no inspection, and no authorization. I printed everything, clipped it together, and slid it into a manila envelope labeled Evidence A. Just before noon, I got a knock at the door. It was Curtis Hodge, one of the HOA board members. He looked uncomfortable, like someone had dragged him over against his better judgment. "Xander," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Lorraine asked me to talk to you. She said there's some misunderstanding about the youth activity installation." "Nothing to misunderstand," I said, stepping outside. "She dumped a skate park on my garden. Without notice. Without permission. On land she doesn't own." "I get that," Curtis said quickly. "But she said it's temporary. The kids just needed somewhere to hang out this summer. Then put it in her yard. She said hers wasn't level enough. That's her problem." He shifted from foot to foot. "Look, I'm not trying to pick a side here. But a few of us on the board, me, Diane, even Tom, we didn't vote on this. She said it was already approved when she brought it up. Let me guess. She told you there was a clause."
Yeah, Section 8 something.
"You checked. It doesn't exist." Curtis scrubbed a hand through his thinning hair. "I knew it fell off. She's been pushing through a lot lately without real votes. Last month she signed off on a new security gate without a meeting. How much is she spending from the HOA fund?"
No idea.
"Lorraine keeps the books herself. Says it's more efficient." That was a red flag the size of a billboard. "Curtis, you ever seen the actual financials?" "Not since the annual meeting. Even then, it was just a summary slide." I nodded. "Thanks. That's all I needed." He frowned. "What are you going to do?" "Start pulling the thread." Diego showed up a little after 3. He came in plain clothes, but had his badge clipped to his belt. He didn't waste time. We walked the property line together, checking the survey markers and comparing them to the plat map. Then he crouched next to one of the ramps and let out a low whistle. They used fast-set concrete. Industrial grade. This wasn't a pop-up job. That mixer stain on the curb? That means she contracted someone. Probably under the table. I haven't seen trucks out here. She probably scheduled them mid-morning, when most folks are at work. I'll check the nearby traffic cams. He photographed the ramps, the damage to the garden, and the area around the base where the concrete had cracked the decorative stone border. Then he pointed to the tripod camera. "Send me that footage when you're done recording. I'll log it as evidence." "Are we pushing this as civil or criminal?" "Both. But criminal first. Unlawful construction, trespass, destruction of property, and if she used HOA funds and misuse of fiduciary resources." I blinked. "That's felony territory. Depends on how deep it goes." The next morning, I got a visit from 2 teenagers. One of them was the kid who wiped out on the rail. The other looked nervous. "Hey," the first one said. "We didn't know it was your yard. Mrs. Edgewood told us it was part of the neighborhood green zone." "There is no green zone. You're on my private property." "We're sorry," the second kid said. "She paid us $20 each to skate there when people were around. Said it was for community morale." I stared at them. "She paid you?"
Yeah.
"Said she'd double it if we came back tomorrow." I thanked them and asked if they'd be willing to write that down. They agreed. I added their statements to the growing folder. By that afternoon, Diego had pulled street cam footage showing a rented flatbed truck parked outside my fence 2 mornings ago. It matched the time window when the ramps appeared. He traced the license plate to a landscaping company 2 towns over one that didn't have a valid contractor license on file. That was enough. By Friday, Diego had filed a full report with the city prosecutor and submitted a request for a cease and desist order. A judge reviewed the initial evidence and issued a mandatory removal notice, pending further investigation. But Lorraine wasn't done. Saturday morning, I woke up to find a bright yellow violation notice taped to my front door. It claimed I was in breach of community harmony for failure to support approved recreational development. The fine? $200 per day. I didn't even tear it down. I just took a photo and handed it to Diego. She's doubling down, I said. She's panicking, he replied, which means she knows she's in deep. By Sunday, the neighborhood grapevine had caught fire. People were knocking on my door, asking questions. Diane from the board asked to see the footage. Tom wanted a copy of the permit history. Even Curtis came back, this time with a folder of his own handwritten notes from past meetings where Lorraine had made executive decisions without any record of board votes. It was all unraveling. And then came the audit. With mounting pressure from residents and a few anonymous calls to the county office, one of which may have come from a payphone near my shop, a formal financial audit of the HOA's account was launched. The preliminary findings? Over $20,000 in unapproved spending. Landscaping invoices with no contractor license. Payments to community development consultants that traced back to a non-existent LLC registered under a P.O. box. In Lorraine's maiden name. That's when the real fallout started. By Monday morning, the audit findings had made their way to the county clerk's office. I didn't need to knock on doors. Any more neighbors were showing up uninvited, carrying folders, screenshots, even check stubs from their HOA dues. Years of blind trust were unraveling, and Lorraine was nowhere to be seen. I was tightening bolts under a pickup in my garage when Diego pulled up. He didn't get out right away. He just leaned back in his seat, watching the house across the street like it might do something suspicious if he blinked. "She's lawyering up," he said when he finally stepped into the shade of the garage. "Hired someone from out of town. Expensive firm." I slid out from under the truck. With whose money? That's what the county's about to find out. They've frozen the HOA's accounts pending investigation. Every outgoing transfer since last year's budget meeting is under review, especially the payments to that shell LLC. I wiped my hands on a rag. She's not just in over her head. She's drowning. Diego nodded. And she knows it. That's why she's trying to plug holes before the ship sinks. She filed a counter-complaint this morning. Claims you maliciously interfered with a community development initiative and slandered an elected official. I laughed once, bitterly. She's not even trying to sound believable. Nope.
Just trying to buy time.
Delay the inevitable. I glanced at the ramp still occupying my crushed flower garden. We still on schedule for removal? City contractors already scheduled. Judge signed the removal order about an hour ago. It'll be gone by tomorrow afternoon. Good, I said, folding my arms. Because I'm not rebuilding that garden with a single concrete flake left behind. Diego hesitated. There's more. I raised an eyebrow. She used HOA funds to secure a short-term loan. Back in February. Claimed it was for emergency sidewalk repairs after that winter storm. There weren't any sidewalk repairs.
Exactly.
The loan was wired to a private account 3 days later. And guess who's listed as the account's sole beneficiary? I didn't answer. Her son. The one who's been between jobs for the last 4 years. So we're past fraud now. Way past. We're looking at embezzlement, falsifying financial documents, misappropriation of funds, and now possible conspiracy to commit theft. I let out a low whistle. And all of that started with a couple of ramps on my lawn. Diego gave a dry chuckle. That's the thing about people like Lorraine. They get away with so much for so long, they think they're invincible. But the second they get cocky, they leave fingerprints. That afternoon, I got a call from the city inspector. They were sending a team to document the construction for criminal charges. I offered to stay out of their way, but they asked me to remain present for verification. I spent the next few hours gathering every bit of documentation I hadn't already submitted, date-stamped photos, screenshots of Lorraine's directives, and a copy of the HOA's last public newsletter, which made zero mention of any recreational development. The city crew arrived just before sunset. 2 trucks for workers and 1 very determined code compliance officer. I watched from the porch as they examined the ramps, took core samples of the concrete, and flagged the boundary lines with neon tape. The officer, a wiry woman named Marla, approached with a clipboard. "Mr. Sutton, we've confirmed the ramps were installed without permit, in violation of Municipal Code 12-19. That's not even including the trespass. Does that help the case?" "Oh, it doesn't just help. It nails it to the wall. We've got unauthorized construction, no inspection, and no contractor license on file." That's a trifecta. As they packed up, she handed me a formal notice. "Official removal begins at 0800 tomorrow. You don't need to do a thing. Just keep your cameras rolling." I gave her a nod. "You got it." Around 8 that evening, I heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel under tires. I looked out the front window and saw Lorraine's car parked at the curb. She stood there for a moment, staring at the ramps like she could will them to disappear. Then she marched up the walkway and knocked on the door. 3 times. Sharp and fast, like a drum roll for bad decisions. I opened the door, but didn't step aside. "We're not speaking without attorneys present," I said. "This is harassment," she snapped, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Those ramps were approved by a standing board. You had no right to involve the city." "Funny," I said, crossing my arms. "Because that same board's been handing me copies of meetings you never held, votes you never took, and payments you never disclosed." She glanced around, noticing the camera mounted above my porch for the first time. Her jaw tightened. "You're orchestrating a witch hunt." "No," I said calmly. "You did that. I'm just the guy who lit the torch." Her expression shifted, less angry now, more calculating. "If you think the city will side with a mechanic over a legal homeowner association, you're deluding yourself. I've been running this neighborhood for 12 years. I didn't respond. I just stepped back far enough for her to see the thick envelope on the table behind me, labeled, notarized, and sealed. "That's a sworn affidavit from 3 board members," I said. "And 2 teenagers you paid to loiter on property you didn't own. Plus a statement from the unlicensed contractor you stiffed on payment." Her face drained of color. "Tomorrow morning," I said, "you're going to wake up and the ramps will be gone. The flower bed will be cleared. And your reign over this neighborhood? That ends right here." She didn't speak again, just turned and walked back to her car with the stiff, mechanical steps of someone trying not to run. By the time the sun rose, the city crew was already at work. I stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching as they jackhammered the concrete, lifted the ramps onto a flatbed, and carted away every trace of Lorraine's little empire expansion. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalk. Some waved. A few clapped. Diane brought folding chairs for herself and Tom, who sipped from a thermos like he was front row at a concert. Curtis leaned on the fence beside me. "You know she tried to call an emergency meeting last night? Let me guess. No one showed. Not one person. She's finished." It took 6 hours to remove everything. Once the last truck pulled away, I walked out with a rake and began clearing the remaining debris. I didn't need help, but half a dozen neighbors joined in anyway. Someone brought a cooler. Someone else set up a portable speaker. By dusk, the flower bed was level again. Later that evening, I got a call from Diego. "They've issued an arrest warrant." I sat down on the porch swing. "For what charge?" "Multiple. Embezzlement, wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and abuse of fiduciary duty. She won't be home long enough to pack a bag. They're picking her up tonight." I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't need to. She'll probably try to spin it, I said. Blame the board. Blame the bylaws. She's already tried, Diego said. Didn't work. Prosecutor has the receipts. Literally. I watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. Think they'll dissolve the HOA?
No.
But they'll restructure it. New bylaws, new board, mandatory transparency. About time. He paused. You did good, Xander. Most people just grumble and pay the fines. You stood your ground. Wasn't just me, I said. Takes a neighborhood.
He laughed.
Yeah. But it helps to have a cousin in the force. We ended the call, and I went back inside. The house felt lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from the walls themselves. The next morning, a letter arrived from the city. It contained a formal apology for the oversight and a voucher for soil restoration services. Apparently, someone in zoning had flagged the incident for municipal review. I pinned it to the fridge next to my original deed. That same day, the HOA held an emergency election. Curtis was voted in as interim president. Diane took over finances, and Tom was appointed oversight liaison. They met publicly, streamed it online, and opened the books for the first time in years. Lorraine? She didn't make bail. Turns out she'd used HOA funds as collateral on a second private loan. That put her at risk of flight, and the judge wasn't in the mood for leniency. The ramps were gone. My tulips would need time, but the soil was clean. The cameras stayed up. Not because I expected trouble, but because it didn't hurt to keep an eye out. And the next time someone tried to run this neighborhood like a dictatorship, they'd know exactly whose garden they were stepping into. By the end of the week, Lorraine Edgewood's name wasn't spoken out loud so much as whispered like a bad omen. Her colonial sat dark behind drawn curtains, the flamingo mailbox removed, leaving only a rusted post and a patch of dead grass. A county-issued sign now hung in the front window, property seized pending investigation. It was as if the house itself had gone into hiding, embarrassed by its former owner. Curtis stopped by my garage on Thursday afternoon with a clipboard tucked under one arm. He waited until I finished refitting a carburetor before speaking. City's sending a mediator next week, he said. They're helping us rewrite the HOA charter from scratch. No more loopholes, no more unchecked spending. I wiped my hands. You getting much pushback? He shook his head. Not a bit. Turns out all Lorraine ever did was keep people in the dark and call it leadership. Sounds about right. He hesitated, then added, There's one more thing. A lawyer from the state attorney's office is asking to speak with you. Wants a full statement. About the ramps? About everything. They're looking at this as a pattern. She wasn't just misusing funds here, she's done it in 2 other neighborhoods before this. That caught me off guard. You mean she's done this before? She changed her last name after a civil suit in Oak Ridge. Same tactics.
Ubarcar ja dues, voria finances, faca improvaments.
The HOA was too broke to sue her, so she slipped out just before they declared insolvency. I leaned back on my workbench and let that sink in. So she's been running a long con. Long enough to know what she was doing. But this time,
Curtis tapped the clipboard.
She got greedy. Over the weekend, I met with a state attorney's investigator in a conference room at the local courthouse. The man wore a quiet suit and spoke with the calm deliberation of someone used to breaking down corporate fraud cases. He laid out a timeline, and I filled in the gaps: dates, names, exact quotes Lorraine had used when justifying her so-called developments. He showed me copies of wire transfers from HOA accounts to private accounts traced to Lorraine's son and a second cousin in Nevada. There was even a payment labeled Community Enrichment Initiative that had been funneled into a cryptocurrency wallet. She laundered HOA dues, I said, stunned. She tried, the investigator replied. But she wasn't subtle, and she left a digital trail a mile wide. One of the most damning pieces of evidence turned out to be a single email Lorraine had sent to a landscaping contractor, one of the few she actually paid. In it, She instructed the contractor to list construction on public access land adjacent to a community easement, even though she knew the ramps were being placed on my property. That's falsifying a permit application, I said, and enters the realm of criminal conspiracy. That's why this case is being elevated. The next week, I was called to testify in front of a grand jury. I wasn't alone. Curtis, Diane, and Tom all gave statements. The two teenagers Lorraine had paid to skate on my lawn also testified, along with the unlicensed contractor who admitted she paid him in cash and told him to keep his truck out of sight. The evidence was overwhelming. By the time the grand jury handed down the indictment, the charges against Lorraine had grown to include felony theft, wire fraud, unlawful enrichment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and falsification of public records. Her total estimated theft from HOA funds across 3 neighborhoods hovered just under $80,000. At her arraignment, she pleaded not guilty. But the judge denied bail again, citing the pattern of behavior and risk of flight. Her attorney looked like he aged 10 years during the hearing. Meanwhile, back in our neighborhood, things were starting to feel normal again. The new board posted weekly updates online, transparent, plain language summaries of what was being voted on and where every dollar was going. The community began pitching in on small projects, replanting shared flower beds, repainting the welcome sign, even organizing a barbecue for the first time in years. One morning, 2 city workers arrived with a truck full of mulch and soil amendments. They restored the spot where the ramps had been, tilling the compacted ground and laying fresh topsoil. I didn't ask for it. Someone on the board must have pulled a few strings. I spent the next few days restoring my flower bed. This time, instead of tulips, I planted a mix of native perennials, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and a few milkweed plants to attract butterflies. I added a small iron bench under the tree, and beside it a little sign that read, "Private property, no ramps allowed." Just subtle enough to amuse. Diego stopped by that Saturday evening, flipping a burger on my grill while I watered the new plants. "They've started reaching out to the other neighborhoods," he said. "The state's building a wider case. If they can prove she used the same tactics in all 3 communities, they'll hit her with federal charges." "Think she'll take a deal?" "She might. But whatever happens, she won't be running anything again. She's already been banned from serving on any board or managing funds in the state." "What about civil restitution?" "Already in motion. The state froze her assets. Some of the stolen funds might be recoverable, especially the ones she wired to family. If they don't cooperate, they can be charged too." I flipped the stakes and shook my head. All because she thought no one would check her work. "She picked the wrong yard this time," Diego said, sipping his soda. That night, a few neighbors joined us. Tom brought a 6-pack, Diane made her famous cornbread, and Curtis showed up with a binder of proposed landscaping ideas. We stayed out on the porch until long after sunset, swapping stories and laughing about the absurdity of it all. For the first time since this mess started, the neighborhood felt like a community again. A month later, I received a certified letter from the county. The final audit of the HOA had been completed. Everything Lorraine touched had been combed over, cross-referenced, and flagged. Thanks to the testimony and documentation, the HOA was officially cleared of liability. The blame fell entirely on her. Inside the envelope was a voucher for landscaping reimbursement courtesy of the county's Community Fraud Recovery Fund. It wouldn't bring back the hours I'd spent rebuilding my garden, but it covered the cost of every plant, every bag of soil, and then some. There was also a handwritten note attached. "Thank you for standing your ground. You didn't just protect your property, you helped protect this entire neighborhood." Office of the County Auditor. I pinned it to the corkboard in my garage, right next to the original property map. Curtis announced at the next board meeting that the HOA would now require a full vote and third-party verification before any funds could be spent, no exceptions. Every motion would be recorded, archived, and made available online. The old bylaws were thrown out. The new charter was ratified with unanimous support. And Lorraine? At her sentencing hearing 5 months later, she stood in front of a judge who read off the list of charges for nearly 10 minutes. She was sentenced to 6 years in state prison with no chance of parole for the first 3. The judge called her actions a calculated betrayal of public trust. She didn't look at me once. As I walked out of the courthouse, I passed her attorney now representing her in a civil suit filed by all 3 HOA boards. He didn't speak, just gave a tired nod, like a man who knew he was mopping up after a hurricane. Back at home, I sat on the bench in my garden and watched a monarch butterfly circle the milkweed. The air was quiet, the street calm. No ramps, no concrete, no HOA president barking orders from a clipboard. Just flowers, sunshine, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that justice, not just for me, but for everyone she tried to manipulate, had finally bloomed. And this time, it was here to stay.